Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, June 21st. Tonight, we begin with the celebrations and solemn ceremonies being held across the country to mark National Indigenous Peoples Day. This is a holiday that means a lot more to Canadians following the discovery of over 1,000 unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools. The residential school memorial is being dedicated on the grounds of Government House in Saskatchewan. Brantford, Ontario residential school survivor Diane Hill believes National Indigenous Peoples Day is becoming more broadly recognized and that it is a call to reflect on the darker aspects of Canadian history. Today's Google Doodle celebrates the work of Ojibwe artist Norval Morisseau, who founded what's become known as the Woodland School. Meanwhile, the federal government is responding to a recent federal court decision which allows a class action lawsuit against Ottawa to go ahead. The government says it's reviewing the details of yesterday's decision. The suit seeks to hold the government responsible for the struggle of Indigenous children who were taken from their families living off reserve and placed in care between 1992 and 2019. Ottawa agreed last year to compensate on-reserve youth and their families affected by the child welfare system. But Representative Plaintiff Cheyenne Stonechild says she and thousands of other off-reserve youth were no less harmed by the system, nor are they any less Indigenous. Turning to the government's efforts to tackle inflation now, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen say the two countries are working together to combat rising inflation. The pair spoke about the turbulent global economy at a joint news conference in downtown Toronto yesterday. This marks Ms. Yellen's first trip to Canada as Secretary of the Treasury. Ms. Freeland said the two countries are facing a consequential time for the world economy, which comes with a historic opportunity to ensure resiliency in supply chains. She and Ms. Yellen said they discussed how to keep costs down for families on both sides of the border amid soaring consumer prices. A federal unit has identified what it says is a coordinated campaign by Chinese state media about the return of the two Michaels to Canada. It is the latest window into a tense geopolitical drama that played out between Ottawa and Beijing over almost 3 years. The Canadian press used the Access to Information Act to obtain an analysis of the events of September 2021. Rapid Response Mechanism Canada also found China seemed intent on fostering confusion or doubt in Canada and internationally about what Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were doing in China before they were detained. Meanwhile, a United Nations summit on biodiversity will be held in Canada instead of China. This is the second major international event to be moved from China because of its strict anti-coronavirus policies. China's Environment Ministry says the meeting will be held in December in Montreal. It says the decision was made after comprehensively considering the pandemic situation at home and abroad. China has stuck to a strict zero-COVID policy that has limited international visitors and repeatedly locked down parts or all of cities to stamp out any outbreak. Turning to a new report by researchers at Dalhousie University in Halifax, which shows women in the Greater Toronto area experienced more frequent and often more severe violence during the pandemic. The team found that pandemic-related restrictions and women being isolated at home with abusive partners made it more difficult for them to access counseling and legal support. The report recommends increased funding for organizations dealing with violence against women and improved access to services. Experts are weighing in on what decriminalizing drug possession will mean for Canada. This comes as British Columbia prepares to be the first in the country to make that change. Starting next year, BC will ensure drug users will not be arrested or charged for carrying up to 2.5 grams of illicit drugs. M.J. Malloy, a research scientist at the BC Centre on Substance Use, says decades of research has found that criminal penalties do not dissuade people from using drugs. In fact, experts say drug use is often a way for people to cope with past trauma or mental health issues, and going to prison can actually make that worse. The Crown Prince of Luxembourg is singing Canada's praises on an official trip to Toronto. Prince Guillaume Jean-Joseph Marie is on a trade mission with members of the government. This comes as Luxembourg looks to deepen cooperation on high-tech and cybersecurity. But he says not many people know that his great-grandparents, grandfather, and other royal family members lived on a farm in Quebec after the Nazis invaded in 1940. Up next, a look at new plastic regulations and environmental racism. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Canada's federal government has implemented a regulatory ban on 6 single-use plastic items. This regulation bans companies from importing or making plastic bags, takeout containers, plastic straws, cutlery, stir sticks, and six-pack rings by the end of this year. Meanwhile, the House of Commons has resumed debate on Bill C-226, also known as the Environmental Racism Bill. The Canadian Coalition for Environment and Climate Justice has urged the government to expedite this bill's passage to the Senate before the summer recess. Well, joining us today to discuss these recent moves is Dr. Ingrid Waldron, co-founder and co-director of the CCECJ. Dr. Waldron, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with this, ma'am. What exactly is environmental racism, and what does it look like in Canada?
Environmental racism is a term that was coined in the early 1980s. So it's a term that's been around for quite some time. And basically what it means is that certain communities, particularly Indigenous and communities of color, tend to be selected disproportionately for the siting of environmental hazards like dumps, landfills, incinerators, more than other communities. And that the spatial patterning of industry, predominantly in communities of color, is an outcome of environmental policy and decision-making.
And how does Bill C-226 address the issue of environmental racism in Canada?
It addresses environmental racism in a number of ways. For the first time, with respect to this particular issue of environmental racism, we're asking the government to collect disaggregated race-based data, but race and socioeconomic status and environmental risk. So that's a bit groundbreaking. It's the first time that we've asked the government to do that with respect to this particular issue. It's also going to look at getting statistics on health risks associated with these industries, providing compensation to communities that have been impacted, and also kind of tracking cases of environmental racism across the country.
So it seems that this bill, there's a lot of research involved in this bill. So is there anything missing in terms of action to address this issue?
I don't think there's anything missing in terms of action. When I look at the bill now, I think perhaps we could have articulated certain things in a much more forceful way. When we talk about compensation, I don't want people to think that we are only looking at past cases or historical cases, because certainly, there's reparations required for Africville in Nova Scotia, and that's no longer a community in Halifax. They've dispersed. So I'm not sure if the language is strong enough in the bill in terms of, we do want to know about past cases and historical cases. We want to know about ongoing cases, but we also want to know about future cases of environmental racism. This bill is preventative. So it's not only looking back, but it's also looking forward. So I'm not sure if that comes out strongly enough in the bill, but that's, to me, the only thing that I would say would be missing.
All right, Dr. Waldron, well, we know your organization is pushing to expedite this bill. So what kind of responses have you been getting from officials regarding this?
I'm pretty good. We're hearing that the NDP, the Liberal Party, of course, and the Green Party will be supporting this bill. I've been watching the debates for quite some time, and it's very clear that those parties will be supporting the bill. And basically, that's really all we need to get this bill passed. Is votes, positive votes from those three parties. So I'm extremely hopeful, more than I ever have been. I've been doing this since 2015 provincially in Nova Scotia. I'm much more excited than I've ever been, and I think it's going to pass.
Sounds like some good news, Dr. Waldron. Now, considering today is National Indigenous Persons Day across Canada, how are Indigenous peoples impacted by environmental racism in this country in particular?
Well, it's clear that Indigenous people are more impacted by environmental racism than any other population in Canada. So you think about P2 Landing First Nation. Boat Harbor was a toxic site there that was finally closed after 60 years, closed in 2020. We think of Amjinwang First Nation near Sarnia, Ontario. They're surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities. A current case that's getting a lot of attention is Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern BC. They're kind of advocating against a multi-billion-dollar pipeline. There's the Wabanagi First Nation in Nova Scotia that was finally closed at the end of last year. So there have been some achievements, but we have cases popping up all the time. And I think Wet'suwet'en is one of the most serious cases. But there are also cases that many people don't know anything about. They don't get much media attention, which is actually one of the goals of the coalition. The coalition I co-founded with Nalu Charles is to start mapping and tracking and identifying cases of environmental racism that many people are unaware of.
Some very important work. Dr. Waldron, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, news from around Canada and the world as retail sales rise in April and the Collision Tech Conference gets underway in Toronto. We'll be right back shortly. A new report from Statistics Canada indicates retail sales were up 0.9% to $60.7 billion in April. Sales at general merchandise stores gained 4.2%, while sales at miscellaneous store retailers, such as pet stores, cannabis dispensaries, and office supply stores, rose 11.3%. Core retail sales also rose 1%. All right, turning to Toronto now, where about 35,000 startup leaders, investors, and tech workers are attending the four-day Collision Tech Conference that got underway this morning. They're going to listen to more than 600 speakers, including former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and basketball star Carmelo Anthony. Collision CEO Patty Cosgrave expects the downturn in tech stocks to be a hot topic at the conference, along with the state of crypto. On the West Coast, the city of Kamloops, BC, has activated its Emergency Operations Center. This comes as rain is in the forecast at the headwaters of the North and South Thompson Rivers. A statement on the city's website says river forecasts are calling for a spike in river levels this week, and activating the emergency center is a precautionary measure that will help the city respond quickly if the situation worsens. Meanwhile, much of the northern and southern Ontario regions are under a heat warning. Environment Canada is predicting temperatures will soar into the low or even mid-30s on Tuesday and Wednesday for large parts of the province. Temperatures are expected to cool down by Thursday. In the U.S., President Joe Biden has signed off on giving federal wildland firefighters a hefty raise for the next 2 fiscal years. The move affects over 16,000 firefighters and comes as much of the American West braces for another difficult wildfire season. The pay raises were included in last year's infrastructure bill. Agencies may increase the base salary of federal wildland firefighters by $20,000 per year or 50% of their current base salary, whichever is lower. Moving to southern China now, where heavy rainstorms are causing major flooding and landslides. The weather is destroying buildings, crops, and roads, and forcing many people to flee their homes. In the Guangxi Autonomous Region, 145,000 people were relocated to safety, and more than 10,000 houses were destroyed. Authorities say another 500,000 people were affected in the neighboring Jiangxi province. This is where more than 400,000 hectares of crops were flooded. The Meteorological Department is forecasting more rain in coming days. Meanwhile, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says talks with China's leader are key to regional and international peace and stability. This comes amid growing tensions over territorial disputes and Beijing's increased military activity around Japan. In September, the two countries will mark the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Mr. Kishida also said talks with South Korea are important because of the worsening security environment in the region, but that they depend on progress in their disputes over wartime history. Mr. Kishida was speaking at a party leaders' debate ahead of July parliamentary elections. Official reaction to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's speech to the African Union was muted. Mr. Zelensky told leaders that Africa has been taken hostage in Russia's invasion. Ukraine and the West hope to weaken Africa's ties to Russia by emphasizing that Moscow is to blame for dramatic shortages of wheat and edible oils, as well as skyrocketing food and fuel prices across the continent of 1.3 billion people. Russia is the largest weapons exporter to sub-Saharan Africa, and Moscow emphasizes its long ties with African nations dating to the Soviet Union. In the UK, tens of thousands of railway workers have walked off the job. This brings the train network to a crawl in the country's biggest transit strike in 3 decades. About 40,000 cleaners, signalers, maintenance workers, and station staff are holding a 24-hour strike today. 2 more are planned for Thursday and Saturday. Only about 20% of passenger trains are scheduled to run. The dispute centers on pay, working conditions, and job security. The company that makes Frosted Flakes, Rice Krispies, and Eggo waffles is splitting into 3 companies. Kellogg's says the 3 units will focus on cereals, snacks, and plant-based foods. General Electric, IBM, and Johnson & Johnson also announced splits recently, but they're fairly rare for food producers. NASA has fueled its huge moon rocket for the first time and completed a countdown test despite a fuel line leak. This was NASA's 4th crack at the all-important dress rehearsal from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It was the last major milestone before the moon rocket's long-awaited launch debut in August at the earliest. Previous attempts in April were thwarted by a fuel leak as well as stuck valves and other technical issues. Forum Daily will be right back. Stay tuned for more news from around the world. We'll be back after a short break. The Russian military is now in control of about 95% of Ukraine's eastern Luhansk region. But pockets of resistance are denying Moscow full military control of the region. Its governor says everything that can burn is on fire. This comes with Russia attacking with howitzers, multiple rocket launchers, large caliber artillery, and missile strikes. It's been almost 4 months after the Kremlin launched its invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia's security chief on Tuesday said Moscow will respond to a recent move by Lithuania. Earlier this month, Lithuanian authorities announced a ban that will bar rail transit of goods from Russia to a Russian Baltic Sea exclave. The move was subject to European Union sanctions, and it prompted a flurry of angry retorts from Moscow, with the Kremlin denouncing the move as unprecedented and unlawful. All right, turning to a tense encounter in the strategic Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. Navy warship has fired a warning flare to wave off an Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboat coming straight at it. The incident on Monday involving the Guard and the Navy comes as tensions remain high over stalled negotiations of Iran's tattered nuclear deal with world powers. The United Nations nuclear watchdog said on Tuesday that Iran now plans to enrich uranium through a second set of advanced centrifuges at its underground Fordo facility amid the standoff. Moving to Israel, where a cabinet minister says the country's outgoing coalition government will fast-track a bill this week to dissolve parliament. This is setting up the country for its 5th elections in 3 years. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said on Monday that he would disband his alliance of 8 diverse parties and send the country to the polls. New elections are likely to be scheduled for October. They raised the possibility that longtime leader Benjamin Netanyahu, now opposition leader, will be able to stage a comeback. A major strike in Zimbabwe among nurses and other healthcare workers has brought the country's government hospitals to a near standstill. The health professionals stopped working after rejecting the government's offer of a 100% pay rise. They say it is inadequate to meet their needs. This comes amid skyrocketing inflation of 130%. Health workers want to be paid in United States dollars because salaries in local currency are being eroded by inflation. Zimbabwe Nurses Association President Enoch Dongo said most health workers are taking home less than $200 a month. Finally, some good news for Twitter as shares rose before the opening bell on Wall Street. This comes after its board unanimously recommended that shareholders approve Elon Musk's $44 billion bid to buy the company. Mr. Musk reiterated his desire to move forward with the acquisition last week during a virtual meeting with Twitter employees. The Tesla CEO has offered $54.20 per share. Twitter shares remain far below that price, signaling considerable doubt that the deal will actually happen. And the final price tag for last year's COVID-delayed Tokyo Olympics has been put at $13 billion. The Tokyo Organizing Committee announced the final cost before the body is dissolved at the end of the month. It was twice what it was forecast in 2013 when Tokyo was awarded the Games. However, the final price tag presented by organizers is lower than the $15.4 billion they predicted when the Olympics ended just under 11 months ago. The University of Oxford, in a study several years ago, said Tokyo was the most expensive Olympics on record. Thousands of Druids, pagans, and New Age revelers have greeted the summer solstice at Stonehenge on the longest day of the Northern Hemisphere year. Wiltshire police said 6,000 people gathered at the ancient stone circle in southern England this morning to watch the sun rise locally at 4:49 a.m. Stonehenge was built between 5,000 and 3,500 years ago. It is aligned so that on summer solstice, the sun rises behind the heel stone and rays of sunlight are channeled into the center of the circle. Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dmitry Muratov says he was not expecting the medal that he was auctioning off to help Ukrainian child refugees would sell for the whopping amount of money that it did. Bidding ended in New York last night on World Refugee Day, and the medal sold for the record amount of $103.5 million US. The sale shatters the old $4.76 million record for a Nobel medal. The identity of the buyer is not known. Mr. Muratov, a Russian journalist, was co-awarded the medal in October 2021 for his efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website and follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.